This time I want to talk about Ghost Rider by Neil Peart. Now you may recognize that name if you're as old as I am. Neil Peart used to be the drummer of the band Rush, and he's actually, he died a couple years ago. Was it a couple years ago? I can't remember. This is a story, I didn't know anything about this when I was, a younger person who just loved the music. Me and my buddy, a friend of mine, got me introduced to Rush, and it was, back then it was all Tom Sawyer and Limelight and Red Barchetta. We'd sit in the room and blast the albums, actual vinyl. Remember what that was like, and liked Rush well enough. I wasn't a fanboy where I had all the Rush memorabilia and knew everything about all the people. I liked their music. I generally liked kind of the stories that they would tell, and that was as far as it went. And then when I got into motorcycling, I found out, hey, Neil was a motorcyclist. So cool, how cool is that? And ended up buying Ghost Rider, only to find out something I didn't know about Neil, which, spoiler alert, his daughter was killed on her way back to college, and his wife ended up dying shortly thereafter. I think it was a year. She just couldn't get over it. She basically, however they classify those kinds of things, she basically died of heartbreak. And so Neil, who had been riding often between the concerts, so like in the US, if they had concerts in many cities, afterwards he would get on his BMW motorcycle and with a guy with him, and they would ride to the next town. So everyone else is taking the tour bus, Neil would be on his motorcycle. I thought, how awesome is that, right? We need more of that these days. But I didn't know anything about this. And so reading this book, I learned about that, but then also learning about his loss and how he used motorcycling, because he took off on it. He ended up going on this big long trip, and it was his way to recovery. And so he took his BMW and rode all around the US. I'd have to reread or see all the places he went. But and then he used this book as a way to work through the grief and to sort of find the next stage and the next page in his life, which he was able to do. He ended up going home a couple times in Canada and worked on his property there, and then back. So he had a couple of stints, many miles, many weeks on the bike, and he ended up meeting somebody down in Los Angeles. I think it was Los Angeles, somewhere in California, and so it's just a really amazing story, and it's intermixed a bit with letters that he wrote to a friend of his, and his real close friend. And so, for example, he's got letters to Brutus, and so he would write, to him specifically. So it's not so much. It's you sort of you have a combination of him writing about the trip and telling the story of his trip, but then also you'd have a letter that he wrote specifically to a friend. So it's kind of got both things in there, which is, I think, an interesting way to go about it. And then being that Neil was he's, if you're familiar with the band, you know that he wrote, he was like the main writer of their music. And so in all of the chapters, there's always a verse from one of the songs, which is, I think, kind of poignant and interesting too, because somebody who has this kind of depth of not only creativity, but a certain, what's the word I'm looking for? Sincerity about them. Who if you're familiar with Rush's music, it's not just let's dance and party and have some fun. These things have messages, and sometimes they're really hard to unravel. I read some of the lyrics, I'm like, what is this? And sometimes it's it's almost about the fact that it rhymed properly, but I don't know. I get a sense from reading this that there was a lot of it. He was almost too deep sometimes for someone as simple as me. But the book Ghost Rider is definitely high up on my list. Worth getting a copy. I picked this one up. I think I also have bought a PDF version of it too, so I can have it digital. So I think there's obviously probably Kindle versions as well, but you might be able to find a used copy somewhere. I find it really fascinating to learn what I learned about Mr. Peart. So Ghost Rider, travels on the healing road. Absolutely.